All right, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think we have people joining us from all over the world now. Very exciting. So today we read Poetic Diction and Legal Fiction by Owen Barfield, and it was Ashton's turn to introduce the chapter. He's at the Goetheanum, as some of you know, and the youth section this morning begged him to be part of a meeting asking the question whether or not the world would be better off without the internet. And so he decided to go to that, but he recorded a short introduction to this chapter for us. And so I'm going to play that. It's about 9 minutes long, and then we'll continue our discussion as normal. All right. Share sound. All right. And can you all see this video? All right. Here we go.
This is a short summary of the essay or article by Owen Barfield in the Rediscovery of Meaning titled Poetic Diction and Legal Fiction. This is the summary I would have given live for our next Urphenomen reading group meeting, but unfortunately I won't be able to be there, so I pre-recorded it for you here. So in this essay, Barfield says that what he's especially interested in is the coming into being of meaning, the creation of new meaning through poetic use of language. And he says at the beginning of this essay that the sort of essence of the poetic use of language is figurative, or is to illustrate or express something by means of something else. And he describes a kind of gamut or spectrum of this intensity, where you have the simile, where you're saying something is like another thing, to metaphor in the middle, where you say, my love is a rose, where there's a kind of like identity between the two things, and then the symbol, where it's not so clear what the other thing is that's symbolized, because they sort of collapse together. A and B, A being the meaning and B the symbol, become one. And he has this sort of formula for understanding like a truly effective metaphor, which also ends up being a poetic use of language or diction that ends up producing actual new meaning. So he says that B, which is actually said, that which is actually said, ought to be in some sense the best, if not the only way of expressing A, the meaning, satisfactorily. The mind should dwell on it as well as on A, and thus the two should somehow inevitably be fused together into a new, well, he doesn't say new here, but simple meaning. And as we've explored in prior essays, this is sort of the essence of language itself, as a kind of tissue of dead metaphors that we don't recognize anymore as metaphors or symbols for concepts. And he coins this word tarning, drawing on the German word Tarhelm, which he mentions the Nazis using for their propaganda, to just refer to this general use of language to say one thing but mean another. He says, we seem to owe all these tropes in language and metaphors embedded in language to the fact that somebody at some time had the wit to say one thing and mean another, and that somebody else had the wit to tumble to the new meaning, to detect the bouquet of new wine emanating from the old bottle. And he says that admittedly this happens so quickly that you can't really track it. But there is another sphere of human life where this tarning process can be tracked, and that it's sort of the transformation of human consciousness that it illustrates can be seen in more slow motion. And for him, this is law and legal fictions that facilitate the emergence of like new meaning or new apprehensions from what he describes as the genealogical way of looking at human beings, where it's what kind of being you are and your sort of status and like what family you're born into, your skin color, whatever it might have been, that determines your rights, versus the personal way, which is more based on like how one exerts their own free will. the movement from status to contract, like this emphasis maybe from like kind of group soul oriented law to law based on free individuality. And he says in this older sort of this genealogical way with the feudal system as one of the more recent manifestations of that, there wasn't this sort of clearly published abstract universal law, but instead procedures, forms of procedures that one had to somehow get moving in order to receive a fair hearing from the judge and take someone to court for stealing your land, for instance. But if you were a peasant, or maybe for some reason in the social context not of a favorable rank or reputation, you might not get a fair trial. So instead, Barfield mentions this possibility through the use of legal fictions, where there's a situation where somebody's the rightful property owner, but somebody else is in possession of it. And in order to cast things a different way, so that it is rendered more a question of personal property rather than inheritance of land, they tell this sort of elaborate fiction about having leased the land to someone else who then became dispossessed of it. And this is sort of like a representative of the person in court, and it gets them in front of the judge finally. And even the judge may realize that it's a total fiction, but is able to, because of the fiction, assess the justice of the situation when maybe the customs would have impeded it from happening. And so slowly this shift from the genealogical feudal system to a recognition of individual rights is sort of slowly happening through the fiction. It's not yet maybe dawning in the consciousness of this sort of abstract principle of it, but it's being brought about through this poetry of the made-up circumstance. Then he gives another example which I think makes it more clear when it comes to the rights of a woman to personal property, and like the innovation in the law that you could say is a kind of implicit recognition of women's rights as individual human beings and not just possessions of their husbands. That's like sort of dawning, but Barfield says like it's first unconscious, these sort of perception of rights such as those or that kind of justice, and it's only brought about through this legal fiction, you could say. And so he says, but by a particularly ingenious piece of tarning, the equity judges expressed in the form of law, and in doing so no doubt partly created a more modern view of the rights of married women. They followed the common law doctrine that the husband owned everything, but as to property which someone had given to the wife with the intention that she should have it for her own separate use, the courts of equity began in the 18th century to say that the husband did indeed own this, but he owned it as a trustee for his wife, and they would prevent him from dealing with it in any other way. So it's like this notion of him being a trustee is a kind of fiction covering for giving her a kind of right to her own possession without the tradition of the husband owning everything that belongs to his wife. So just to reiterate this idea that the law itself lay hidden in the unconscious until it was expressed in a judgment, and where rights themselves depended upon the existence of remedies. And this reminds me of Steiner's, the moment in Steiner's The Philosophy of Freedom, where he says there can be no science of ethics, but only a natural history of morality, where we see like these ethical intuitions like coming into existence through the sort of situated negotiation of social life. Now, another great quote: the long analogy which I have been drawing may be expressed more briefly in the formula metaphor, language, meaning, and legal fiction, law, social life. It has no particular significance if poetry is to be regarded only as either a pleasurable way of diverting our leisure hours or a convenient vehicle for the propagation of doctrine. For it must be conceded that there is all the difference in the world between the propagation of a doctrine and the creation of meaning. The doctrine is already formulated, and, if we chose to express it by tarning, that is simply a matter of technique or political strategy. Whereas the creation of meaning, for instance, the recognition of the rights of women, was not prior to the sort of like legal fiction example of the property ownership. It was not at that time a kind of doctrine, part of tradition. It had to be sort of realized, at least, intellectually, maybe in pre-intellectual, the very distant past and matriarchal situation, there was a different way of negotiating these things. But he then goes on to make this additional analogy between the sort of fixity of law and its universal abstract character and the logic character of language, where we're meaning something through a repeated use of the word, but that can become stultified just as abstract laws can be stultified and not sensitive to context. And so, just as a poetic use of language, using a word that has traditionally meant one thing to then bring new meaning into the world, is similar to what's going on with legal fictions and the perception of new ethical intuitions. And so, just like the history of language, the history of law can be approached as a kind of site for getting to know the transformations of human thinking that have transpired over the course of human evolution. And so Barfield can write towards the end, it could hardly fail to be beneficial in far reaching ways at a time when the whole theory of human society is in the melting pot. For instance, a deeper, more sympathetic understanding of the long, slow movement of the human mind from the feudal or genealogical way of regarding human relationships towards what I have called the personal way would do no harm.
Right. So, thank you, Ashton. I found this chapter to be quite stimulating. Barfield, of course, was a barrister and is connecting the evolution of law and the evolution of language in a way that I found quite interesting. I wanted to highlight one thing that Ashton didn't mention, which is Barfield draws on Francis Bacon, who is similarly a lawyer and also trying to develop this new way of understanding nature that would leave behind Plato and Aristotle and so-called Platonic realism about the nature of form, but nonetheless surface this new modern notion of law as something initially that Bacon had to borrow from human social practice and project onto the non-human world. This idea of a law of nature, which is so natural to us today, wasn't so in Bacon's time. And Barfield quotes Bacon trying to make um, this notion stick, and Bacon borrows the term from Plato, form, to refer to uh, a law of nature, but Bacon wants to be very careful not to mean what Plato meant. And so there's something about the merely logical use of language where we can unpack a syllogism. We don't create any new meaning through logical deduction. Whereas in poetry or through this process of tarning, and I think Ashton misspoke a little bit, it wasn't that the Nazis used Tarnung as part of their propaganda, it's that people trying to escape um, Nazi tyranny in Germany would use uh, Tarnung, this word meaning disguise. They would speak in disguised ways to avoid being noticed by the Nazis. Um, but in order to create new meaning, we need to tarn words. We create metaphors, but our metaphors can't be so novel that no one can understand them. It's like when a poetry is a little bit too obscure, you can't quite follow the transfer of meaning that's trying to occur. But nonetheless, we don't want it to be so obvious as to be literal, right? So yeah, very interesting essay. Um, Curious what you all thought about it.
Thanks, Matt. I'll just jump in to say I appreciate what you have just said there and the presentation beforehand, but I don't want to take away from what you said. So hopefully other people will respond to that. I'm just sort of breaking the spell by speaking first. And there's just a few things I wanted to say. One, that I was aware of this essay being a sort of breakthrough essay for grandfather. So it was because it was included in a collection that was put together by C.S. Lewis for Charles Williams, who had just passed away. The collection was celebrating Charles Williams' death. And Lewis then asked grandfather to contribute something. And then grandfather had this sort of in a drawer put aside. He'd written it a lot longer. So we don't know when he wrote it, but it certainly wasn't written in 1947, which is when it was published. And given that grandfather was starting his studies in law in 1930, became a lawyer around about 1933, it's probably in that period when he wrote this essay. But it was, so that's kind of a long time before it was published. But this is the context. And then it's because Americans picked up this book because C.S. Lewis had edited and published it, that's how grandfather got known in America,
Hmm.
and they picked him up from there. And then they started inviting him and having their own conversations with grandfather. But this was his kind of breakthrough piece. So, it's interesting from that perspective. And just to mention that in England we have barristers and solicitors, and grandfather was a solicitor. It's a
Hmm.
type. The main difference is that a solicitor cannot speak in court. So the solicitor has to go through a barrister to speak to the judge. That's the difference. Only the barrister can speak in court. But during grandfather's career as a solicitor, sometimes he was trying to make a legal point when he was addressing the judge through a barrister. And the judge, in a few occasions, because the judge can, because it's his court, he gave grandfather special dispensation to just speak straight to him because it was just a pain having to go through the barrister who wasn't really understanding what was the nuance of grandfather's very technical point. The judge said, just oh look, just tell me straight, tell me what you're trying to say. So grandfather, very unusually for a solicitor, did speak directly because of these kind of legal tangled arguments that he liked to make. So
Yeah.
that's one thing. And just as a small aside, on Sunday, so just a couple of days ago, we had quite a large event here in England, London, commemorating grandfather, and it was very successful. There was a really sort of strong and big buzz about it. So I can sort of say more about that, but just to say, you're not alone. There aren't other people who are starting to turn their attention to this, and that it was a real big impact event, and everybody involved was very happy with it. So thank you for what you're doing there, but just to let you know that other things are starting to happen too.
Hmm. Thank you, Owen. Good to know about that event. Yeah, congratulations on this, on its success, and also the history of this article. Very helpful. Yeah.
I
Um,
would I would love to know what the lineage of this article is because uh, clearly there's a prefiguring of things like saving the appearances in later works where he's more engaged out of Steiner's epistemology. This really intriguing thing that runs through this essay that he does, which is to do the thing that he's describing in the essay as a whole, which is that he uses law and he uses natural science to sort of say something that he's not saying, which is that that which is evidential or that which is appearances can't be spoken about in the language of literalism. It can only be spoken about with the sort of metaphorical ghost in the machine, and this is what he does. This is what he establishes in my mind when he talks about the and why he chooses the symbol rather than staying just with the metaphor, but uses metaphor as that which is generally figurative. And you get that there's something imminently spiritual going on in the language, in the law, and in the representations of natural law that runs through this. And I think it's just so beautifully done. It's one I really feel the need to go back and study and pull back those layers.
mhm. Yeah. Bruce, I see your hand up. We've started a new sort of procedure here, where we just launch in if we want to share something. So, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I am of the one of those people who always feels like they're interrupting when they do that. Um, so I have an example of tarning from 1519, and likely this form of speech existed much earlier than that, and it is when Montezuma came in contact with Cortez, and after their initial meeting, a dinner, Montezuma gives a short speech, and I'll read you the first sentence of that, which you'll understand the Spanish meaning from what the first sentence is, and then I'll try to tell you what I have understood is the Mazidi meaning of the, and I don't know how to pronounce the Aztec meaning. Let's say that. So this is in a formal, noble speech. Our Lord, you are weary. The journey has tired you, but now you have arrived on the earth. You have come to your city, Mexico. You have come here to sit on your throne, to sit under its canopy. The speech goes on like that. And of course, you understand how the Spanish took that the whole speech was a capitulation of the Aztec Empire to Cortez. But the Aztec understanding was this is a standard diplomatic greeting. It's reverential metaphor. It's not literal transfer of ownership. My casa is su casa. It's elaborate. It elaborately demonstrates Montezuma's sophistication, his proper noble behavior. It signals that he is the king. Everyone would recognize it as noble speech, not as anything that we take as literal speech. Now, I'm not sure what this means. I'm just saying this was a really interesting example I came across, and I tried to look into a little bit when this kind of noble speech would have originated. And the basic answer I got was that, the Mesoamerican and South American cultures were very hierarchical. And so it likely originated before 1300, but developed gradually. And then from what I guess we know at this point, we think it at the time of the Aztec, the time of Cortex's coming, it had reached the height. Well, and we of course couldn't get any much more than that because of the destruction of the Aztec Empire. But so I just wanted to share that. And
Very interesting. Thank you, Bruce. Hmm.
I'd like to jump in. This is Jeff, the other Jeff. I have a number of deep associations with the material in this essay, but I'm going to highlight one, and that is when he talks about this legal history, going from the old world, as it were, to the new in terms of just the old family inherited property to this new individual creative power, as we said earlier today, this coming into being of meaning, right? It's not just fixed, that words are always, the same thing, and we can just we can just go along with the same meanings all the time. But this idea of this new consciousness, we understand it, of course, in the beginning of the consciousness soul phase of evolution, and this deepening of this individual consciousness. And for me, in my world, going back to Hahnemann and his Heilkunst and his homeopathy, he was right in the middle of this, in the medical sense, of what he identified as the origin and the nature of disease, the treatment of disease, as what he identified, the German term, the Erzeugungskraft, the generative power. This is the new world, this new world of individuals and this ever creating sense of unfolding meaning and so on. In his technical medical world, Hahnemann gave us, as I said, this Erzeugungskraft, this generative origin and basis of disease and how we cure it. And as I say, this whole essay that we're reading today is profoundly meaningful to me at that dimension, amongst others, as to, yes, we're getting, to understand this becoming of meaning, as I've said, and how this is precisely how we exist now, how our consciousness is structured now, where we've come to in evolution. And as I say, this is just a very profound link for me back into my world. So I just, amongst other things, I wanted to highlight that for now.
Mm. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, this issue of poetic meaning requiring that we say something which on the face of it is nonsense because it's never been said before. It reminds me of there's a recording of maybe did I share this story already? There's a recording of Barfield giving a talk. I think it was in Canada. I forget the university. It was the lecture that became History, Guilt, and Habit, the book. And at the end of this talk, where he's talking about consciousness and the evolution of language and everything, someone raises their hand and just asks him, Dr. Barfield or Mr. Barfield, uh, can you please define consciousness? And there's a pause, a silence for about 5 seconds. And he just says, no, no, I can't. We're moving on. And that, somehow we need handholds, right? We need definitions where you're just, okay, yeah, this is the word I use and this is what I mean by that word. And sometimes people get frustrated with really creative philosophers who write a book and they use a word, but it seems to change its meaning as you go. And they would prefer, I guess, that one write like an analytic philosopher where you just define everything at the beginning and then, but that seems to me to be such a deadening use of language and this insistence on a kind of positivist account where, if words don't refer to physical things in the world, then they are just nonsense. And there was a real push for that. Barfield's always harping on that in so much of his writing. There was a real push for that in the 20th century. Um, and for the most part, that project is acknowledged to have failed, but there are still some holdouts. And I just can't help but wonder in our current time with large language models and this automated form of language, um, what we might be at risk of losing now in terms of how we relate to the creative, poetic power of language, the capacity to bring forth new meaning, because a lot of people are claiming that these large language models can actually uh, make truly new sentences, pronounce new judgments, which there's a great metaphor in this essay where Barfield borrows the term judgment from law to help us understand better what's going on in a metaphor where a new proposition is uttered that connects things in a novel way, that compares things in a novel way. Um, can large language models do that? We're at risk of more and more people believing that they can. And then what do we lose as sort of native language speakers, as human beings, when we allow that to occur? Just a question that occurs to me.
I was thinking along the same lines while reading this, not quite that extensive as relates to LLMs, but bullshit, frankly, in the Frankfurtian sense, right? When is tarning bullshit, right? And the public relations industry and the advertising industry utilizing behavioral sciences, using manipulative sleight of mouth and gesture to represent one thing that's meaning another thing, and you don't even know what it's supposed to be meaning, but it's still manipulating you at the level of desire or your limbic hijacked system, and really, as with the previous essay, there's a degree of critique without nostalgia for the old, a description here of the slow motion convolutions of the law, right? Where he's kind of going, used to be that you had a sort of a, a spirit of the law, and there were only a few ways to get that adjudicated. That there wasn't a lot of techniques for it. Now we're just in the middle of pardon my French here, but shitstorm of ways to get around the law. I've been involved in a couple of civil suits recently, and it's a hot mess. It has nothing to do with the law, right? It has everything to do with the image that you're trying to create such that you can win the case. And that's part of the critique I'm hearing here in his discussion of the law, but also in the way Bacon smuggles in the notion of law into the epistemic commons, right? And that we've accepted as facts. And so the postmodern reaction to that is there are no facts. So we're deeply confused. And it seems like in his prefiguring of in a McLuhan-esque way of the way in which we are unmoored to that which is spiritual in our gestural descriptions, we get lost in the gestural descriptions as literal or factual or bullshit. And then we do believe nothing, and the sort of nihilism seeps in. And I believe his work as a whole is a warning against this, but also an addressing of the meaning that does not have to be lost and that we're all grappling for right now.
Hmm. Yeah.
You mean like the word mandate and law? I mean, what's the difference? I mean, look, the etymology of mandate. And, there was mandated. I have a personal experience with this tarning, I guess, is that I was sitting here one day and I got a text, and it was from two people that I knew that I worked with. Said, look, we would like you to come back to work here. Everything, you did the job. I said, fine. I just said, I'm not going to go and take no vaccination because, that's a health thing. But there was a mandate out there and I couldn't get hired. So not only large models we're worried about, but also the collective of the population of what a mandate is compared to what the law is. And I think that when you go above and beyond, you start to look at these languages and what's in the words and the etymology of everything. But no one would think the logic of it, but they just went with it. And I think, like I even know what Ashton said, I think there's a lot of tarning when it came to what the Nazis did with the laws on the books of before they got in power. So it can go both ways, and we have to look at that. But also, the circumstances have put me where I'm at right now. So, but it's not whether it's good or bad, but I think we need to look deeper into these things. And I really appreciated this essay. Thanks.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks, James. Kat, are you gonna?
Yeah, I wanted to say I have worked in law offices, and this really was enlightening to me because I never really connected the use of metaphor with the law, but I left that, but I saved all my law books because they're so packed with great metaphors, and I never actually realized that before. I thought, well, if I ever write a story, there's so many seeds here. There's just so much pictorial uh, bits in all the stories from the case law. And I think that it would be a really good story starter. So I saved those. But Matt, I also wanted to say something about the zeros and ones for programming language. I actually have done programming as well, and I have a really hard time wrapping my head around AI taking over, because having programmed in a number of languages, it's hard for me to grasp zeros and ones, being able to even design even a really advanced model of thinking. It's hard for me to understand machines grasping the same kind of metaphorical meanings as humans. And so I mean, I hear some pretty good arguments, but it's really hard for me to, because I've done the programming and I just don't see it.
Can I speak to that? I'm sorry, I'm talking way more than I meant to. I think what a fellow who's pretty inspirational in this and kind of also depressing is Zach Stein, and he talks about the issue of personal conferral problems. So it's not just that it's the language, right? It's not just the way, it's that we are, in a sense, and other people who've thought about this way more than I have, but that we, in a sense, are losing the capacity to make metaphors, right? That that the because we're lost in a kind of literalist world of appearances, we have no metaphors to save those appearances, redeem them, resurrect them. Then there's a sort of speciating event going on because of the intervention, the intervening um, um, machine intelligence that uh, does not. Well, he beautifully says it here too, that you recognize the spirit because the spirit is in intercommunion, whereas these um, objects of computational, um, complicated, seemingly human, increasingly human when we add, um, um, the avatars that are looking at more and more human and are more and more becoming tutors for children and are raising children in place of adults increasingly. This is a problem, right? And I don't mean to be a doomsdayer, but just to sort of paint the picture of the way in which we become dumbed down in relationship to the way that the technology is affecting the evolution of our consciousness or the devolution of our consciousness. So I get what you're saying too. I think that's important because it is also uh, part of our immune system if we can, and I think that's what he's saying, right? Like we need the metaphors. We need to be robust in our imaginal world because that world is a phenomenologically real world, just as the representational world that we call laws and um, that we call evidence based reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think he's inviting us to participate in this and in all of his work, really. But I see and totally agree with what you're saying, Jeff, that I actually taught in college and I taught math. And in math, we're getting more and more machine driven. In even the lower levels of math, we're not teaching students to think. And it's scary. It's, I think, possibly because we have Texas Instruments and HP and everybody coming in and saying, here's this free equipment. And so because the university gets the money, they have to, go within these guidelines. They have to use the equipment in the classroom. And it's prohibiting for the teachers and then for the students because they aren't taught to think. They're taught to use that equipment. And I'm right there with you. I think it's scary.
So on that vein, my daughter teaches in an LAUSD public school. She teaches math and science to sixth graders. She herself is a Waldorf student. And so you can imagine she's trying to always enliven her classroom with what she calls participatory science, right? Anyway, so she says that the other day, she instituted a practice of asking the students to begin every science class by coming up with a why or what or how question. And so typically it'll be like, why is the sky blue? And so on and so forth. But then she said, suddenly a kid asked something and everybody just stopped and there were tears in their eyes. And the question that he said is, why do we have to pay to live here?
Hmm.
Whoa.
Hmm.
So the thinking is still there. And she was able to open up that window in her room by simply asking them, inviting them every morning, just come up with a question and take the time around the room to do that.
Joan, I think that's a great example, and I really appreciate that. I really think that's a perfect example of what we're called to do now, not to be afraid of the technology, not to be afraid of what is education happening in those things, but to dive down into that, what people see as darkness, and find ways to transform it. Even if there's small ways, I think that's what we're called for, what's being called now. And so I really appreciate what you added.
Thank you. And I want to add something else. Earlier, we were talking about the difference between mandate and law. And again, within education, um, I'm was very disturbed, obviously, by the rise of the standardized testing law in United LA, I mean, in the United States public school system. And then a friend of mine moved to Palo Alto. And I said to her, so how, and she was thinking of sending her child to a independent school, but then they moved to Palo Alto. Anyway, long story. So I said, so how are you doing now that your kids are, taking those standardized tests? She says, oh, no, I live in Palo Alto. We have plenty of money. It's not a law, it's just policy. It's the bribery, the schools where the parents don't have a lot of money and they need the federal, food stamps and stuff like that. But if the school doesn't need that, we don't have to take the standardized tests. And everybody thinks it's a law, but it's not. It's just policy, or she called it a bribe.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, and the relationship between law and social life, as Barfield explores it, is really interesting here around um, the ways in which peer pressure can function almost like law, in the sense that you wouldn't dare break an expectation if you wanted to remain part of a particular group for fear of being ostracized. Um, and the way in which, Barfield's talking about how, metaphors dry up and become literal in the evolution of language, just as social habits become sort of such deep-rooted expectations that eventually they are articulated by the law, and then they get locked um, in a formal sense. Um, I think the pandemic made those dynamics brought them quite to the surface in an accelerated way. Um, there's also, I mean, just to give another topical uh, example, I don't know if any of you have seen this American Eagle ad that Sydney McSweeney was in that's causing a bit of a stir. I mean, it was a few months ago. Donald Trump weighed in and everything. And advertising, I think, Jeff, you brought in advertising earlier. It's an attempt to convey symbol, right? And in the case of this ad, the Sydney Sweeney is this blonde-haired, blue-eyed young woman, and she's wearing denim, and she just says genes are passed down from parents to offspring, often determining traits like hair color, personality, and even eye color. My genes are blue, she says. And maybe you can guess why this is causing an uproar and why Trump would defend it and progressives would attack it as, what is the symbol here? What is the meaning of this ad that's being conveyed? Um, is it just a funny homonym, or is there some deeper significance? And depending on your the social expectations of the group that you belong to, you're going to see a different symbolism, emanating from this use of words and images. Um, and it strikes me that yeah, it could just be an innocent play on words, or it could be a eugenicist trope, depending on where you stand in those different social circles, right?
Or it
And
could be that it's the medium is the message, and that advertising is designed to sell things. And if you can get people disoriented and at each other's throats, you sell more things. because people fall back into base desires, right? It's not just anger, it's also other profanity or other merely common aspects of what it is to be a human so-called being, right? So we're much more easily manipulated, and you can sell more stuff. Like maybe that's the symbol. Maybe that's the symbol that the medium is the message, and that Facebook is an advertising platform, right? And that information, those symbols are carried through that advertising platform more than any other, right? Than more than an ad on a billboard or on the antiquated versions of television that we see, you know. So just a little salt in that.
Yeah. And yeah, anger, violence, attention, whatever, sex sells also. Maybe the meaning is something more innocent. Just, you can't have my jeans, she's saying, my GENES, but you can have my jeans. You can go buy these jeans if you want, you know.
The word dog whistle comes to mind.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Which itself is a neat alternative term. I mean, it's related to tarning in the sense of a disguised meaning. The dog whistle can't be heard by humans, can be heard by dogs. Which is exactly what this, Barfield's borrowing Tarnung from the German Tarnung, a disguised meaning to get below the Nazi censors. Dog whistle is an interesting adjacent meaning to tarning, I think.
But I think the antidote here is it's not so much say rebellion against the state of things, but it's rather seeing the larger picture. Like for example, in Barfield's concepts of this, the original participation and the final participation, and this understanding that the kind of in between that we go through is something we actually have to go through to arrive at final participation. So I'm also a teacher, and I teach math as well, and it is. I mean, I think it's impossible, given the conditions I have, to actually make sense of the teaching very often. But there's one thing Steiner, he said at one point that I read that kind of inspired me, and he said that the most important role you have as a teacher is to show your students that you're an individual. So if you can somehow demonstrate that you're not caught up in the mainstream narrative. So one of my, say, ways to relate to the students is simply sharing with them that I feel a lot of what we're doing is absurd theater. We are pretending that I'm teaching them stuff, but what we're actually doing has not a lot to do with teaching, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to do because they need grades. Many of them they want good grades and so on, so they have opportunities afterwards. And I mean, it's not up to me to kind of sacrifice their opportunities in life, but I can share what I truly believe about the whole situation that we have in the educational system, and sometimes things about what I think is missing. And often I will also go into what I call storytelling, and I can sense that the students, they actually love that. So I'll share stories from my own life, which was it's been rather nonlinear. So you could say I'm teaching nonlinearity by sharing stories from my own life, just to show them that you don't have to fit into this mainstream kind of molding that's going on all the time. That you can, it's actually possible to do a lot of things in life, and also be kind of pragmatic about the fact that we still have to make a living and so on. But then, I mean, having this understanding of the larger picture, a kind of Christology where you where you see all of evolution as moving towards Christ consciousness and seeing the death of God as a part of that picture, I think is very helpful, and is the actually the best antidote is to see this greater narrative, evolutionary narrative that we're all involved in, and that Steiner and other people are trying to make us see, and Owen Barfield as well.
Which it feels like in many ways is where he's kind of ending the essay around this idea of liberation, which so much of what you all were just talking about the nature of, you know, disguised meanings and tarnings can happen in an American Eagle ad. And those can be, we can use language and metaphor for all kinds of purposes, right? I mean, that symbolism can still happen, but what he seemed to be pointing towards at the end, right, is this, I mean, I love that sentence, that in one of the last paragraphs, properly understood, are they not a telling illustration of the fact that knowledge, the fullest possible awareness of the nature of law, is the true way of escape from its shackles? And this movement of the sort of nature of where this creation of meaning has its depth and roots and spiritual connection pieces, which is also what you were talking about just now, Carson, around bringing up your own story and like being able to like speak about its liberative ways. There isn't just one way to do this. Anyways, that's what was coming up for me around that ending as well.
I love that. And also, you know, thinking about, I don't know, I'm not too much of a student of film, but there was the quote that he says, is there something that you could have as a sort of slow motion picture of the is there a film that imagizes the process of tarning specifically? I don't know. I think Barfield, an image of some sort, but to go off of Bruce's point about the relationality between the human and AI and the merging of the consciousness and the point of singularity, I think utilizing Heidegger, it would have to be a sort of relationality that he says, you know, we have to confront death. And only at that moment of confrontation can we be truly ourselves. Am I myself? At the moment that we exist in the realization of the meaning of merging and becoming transhuman, completely fully think that thought through in a Hegelian way, perhaps then we have another tarning process that will emerge.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that point, Will, and what Karsten was saying too about the importance of the death of God and the evolution of um, consciousness and this null point, as Barfield would call it, when we're most alienated, and it's still a form of participation, but it's a form of alienated participation where the form of figuration that we're enacting makes us feel entirely separate from the natural world around us. But maybe
Well, until we reach that point, you know, in our thought, I don't think we'll feel like we've really gotten there until we've actually thought that thought through.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and felt it. But it strikes me that with, you know, the large language model question, uh, large language models are uh, quantitative processes rooted in probabilities. What's the most probable word that's going to come next? It's totally different from how human beings engage in language. The LLM is not conscious. Language is a support for the evolution of consciousness. And so it could be that the increasing pervasiveness of large language models and the type of outputs that they produce is, in a sense, it's like we have to let the word, the letter rather, die so that we can then be liberated to feel more potently and directly the spirit underlying the letter.
Yeah, I think there is a connection between the problem with education and the problem with the general artificial intelligence, or anyway, the development of large language models to something that actually has a form of judgment, and also the basis of science, the foundations of science, and the foundations of the science of law, or let's say the science of right. So the emergence of right or rights from natural history. If we look back in the period of the scholastic, there were a certain disciplines that were thought to be propedeutic to freedom, meaning that you were only considered a person that was able to think rationally and to judge. So to have the minimum characteristics necessary to be free. After you were acquainted with these disciplines, 3 disciplines related to the language that we normally use to think, and 4 disciplines related to the languages that we have to use to have science of external reality. The first 3 disciplines, called the trivium, were grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and then the quadrivium deals with mathematics. But it's very important that to see that rhetoric was very important. You had grammar, rhetoric, and logic as the building stone of everything. While today we are in a situation where we only have grammar, but we do not recognize it as grammar, while we completely deny the role of rhetorics, because rhetorics is only seen as part of the art of convincing people, of persuasion, while actually rhetorics is the whole science and art of how different words or sentences can relate to the same thing. So while grammar explains what are the relations between words, sentences, and the language in itself, and how this language relates to things, rhetorics is the oblique, the non-bilateral, not simply bilateral correspondence between sentences or words and things, but the whole study of the connections that were complex, that were the different sentences or different words that could relate to the same thing. This was cut out of science, cut out of rationality as something which has nothing to do with it, while of course science can only ever be as precise as our laws are, or as our metaphors are. And so when you repress and cancel out rhetorics, then logics, which is there to then balance out like a judge between the parts of rhetorics, is not really useful anymore and atrophies, while only grammar resists. And so we study nature as it was a sequence of facts without any reason for them. Like when you study the grammar of a language, we are supposed to believe that things are like that just because they are like that when you study, as I said, a grammar. And so this is, of course, waiting on our ability to think, not just scientists, but on in our everyday lives. And sorry, there's no more time. I would have many more things to say about this, but maybe next time we'll get more into it. Also, the idea, I was speaking about the relationship of this with artificial intelligence. I haven't touched on that at all. But to have judgment, I think these liberal sciences, as they were called, liberal arts / sciences of the curriculum of the scholastic period, the trivium and the quadrivium, so these 7 arts, and at least the first three, which are propedeutic to the second four regarding large language models, should be the basis of programming, because it's only with the first step should be having, a part of the software that thinks as of grammar, a part that thinks as rhetoric, and a part that thinks as logic. Then you would start having some sort of language. But at the moment, there is not this repartition, there is no awareness of the problems that this brings about. Okay, sorry, it was too quick, but I have no time. I have to run.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Very interesting. Just one last little tidbit. It reminds me of what Barfield says about it was in the context of law, figuring out personal responsibility, who was responsible for something, that led eventually in the process he describes Francis Bacon trying to work out quite consciously to an understanding of cause and effect in nature, or say laws of nature, right? And so it's like we forget that our understanding of the causal structure of nature and so-called physical laws was actually derived from our understanding of who's responsible for something in a
Yes,
legal
also
context.
medicine, because law,
Mm,
just like science, they all came out of this liberal arts at the
mhm.
same time as
Right,
medicine. And
right.
the place, the hospital bed where you put the patients in ideally equal conditions so that you can study what is actually
Mhm.
causing the symptom,
Uh-huh.
is what is the embryo out of which the laboratory and the whole scientific method came out.
Hmm.
But we'll talk
Right.
about this another time. Thank you. Thank you very much. See you
All
in two
right.
weeks.
Thanks, everyone. See you in 2 weeks. Great conversation.